much, Professor Carole Boyce Davies, for this, and congratulations on your recent publication. And I wanted to start by asking you to take me through the biography of the book, from how you conceived the idea, the process of doing the research, writing, the politics of publishing, and how the book is doing its own rounds currently.
Well, it's interesting. I found that for me, often I'm working on a particular theme, which I end up developing different components for, and then it seems like eventually it becomes a book. So this is what happened here as well, because I had done quite a few years ago an early essay on Condoleezza Rice. I was so baffled by a Black woman who became Secretary of State in the United States and has access to the heights of power. But then how did that end up leading to the war in Iraq, and then, her participation in something that ended up being negative? And it reminded me of a poem by Audre Lorde where she talks about a Black woman in the United States who becomes like a high-ranking person in the U.S. military, and then who was ended up being in charge of leading an invasion of one of the Caribbean countries. So in other words, how do we get compromised even as we're seeking power is something that was precipitating this. But then in terms of biography of the book, two things. One of my colleagues, who is an international lawyer, Jeremy Levitt, had created a collection of essays on Black women in international law. And he knew I was working on Black women and asked me to contribute an essay to it. And so therefore that was the first essay, published essay I did that actually looked at how Black women were writing themselves into political leadership. In fact, that was the title of the essay. So in many ways, that essay and the fact that it was dealing with a question of how Black women position themselves in terms of rights becomes like the sort of genesis of this particular book. And Jeremy Levitt should get credit for encouraging me. Now, two things, taking it further back in terms of biography. After getting an undergraduate degree in English at the University of Maryland, Eastern Shore, I had an interest in going to study international relations. And actually, I did embark on that. And it was quite an interesting thing, because I applied to only two universities, Columbia and American University in Washington, D.C., Columbia, New York. And I actually got admitted to both. But I wanted to be in D.C., so I chose American U. But when I got to that master's program, I did not realize that the cohort of students who would be in that program were like senior level diplomats who were going back to get credentialed. So I was like maybe 22 or 3 or something like that, with platform shoes and hot pants and Afro puffs, exactly how I dressed the first day. And then in class with people with suits. I was just so out of place. So then I was hanging around with friends at Howard. I ended up going to Howard instead and did a master's in African studies, because I was not so unhappy at American at that point. But it was something that I always wanted to do. So in 2000, I actually went and did an LLM, which is a master's in law, this was in intercultural human rights law here at St. Thomas University in Miami. And it was a very intense 1-year program in which we really, had to learn to think, not like academics think, but think like how lawyers think in terms of working on problems via prior cases and so on. So I did that. So therefore, I feel like in a way, this sort of was one of the motivating pretexts for me to pursue thinking about Black women in terms of rights. Because in other words, the intercultural human rights law class I did have a section on African women, but it did not really look at them globally, which is what this book does. So what my book did, and because, as you know, I've worked in literature, it gave me that sort of scope to look at Black women's rights internationally. So in other words, while I could look at the literature in terms of the Caribbean, Africa, Brazil, US African American communities and so on, Canada, the the ability to sort of extend that to look at what's going on in terms of leadership in those places then was the next step. So in the book, what I've done, I see it as sort of a culmination of a lot of things I've done throughout my professional life. So therefore, I thank you for this opportunity to talk about that. What I've done then is analyze the ways in which the literary writers are actually in many ways forecasting some of these movements. So that people like Amata Adu and a number of other writers had already been saying or imagining in their writings ways in which you would have different kinds of advanced ways in which women will be able to access those rights that were being denied. So my assumption is that Black women's rights is an ongoing narrative which began in the last century, but did not really get unfolded fully. And at the start of the book, I mentioned W.B. Du Bois's claim that the last century was going to be the century of the color line. And in that same period, I would say, you know, within the same time frame, you had women also saying, well, what about Black women's rights? So what I did was go back and pick up some of that discourse and then move it forward into the contemporary to see what's going on in terms of Black women's rights to leadership. And one could look at Black women's rights from a number of points of view, but I wanted to focus on leadership in this particular case because that was the interest that I started with in terms of studying this particular topic. So I began then with Sojourner Truth, who actually said, I am a woman's rights. I am a woman's rights. I mean, you could not be more explicit than that. And in several of her discussions, she would bring up the question of rights again. And I found it was a thread in many of the other writings of women in that period. Fascinatingly, in the mid-century, we have a sort of Black feminist movement coming forward by the Sojourners for Truth and Justice, and people like Claudia Jones who have worked on in the 1950s, articulating the fact that women, because they represent half the world, should at least have a claim to half the world's resources. And that's the argument that they would be making at that time. It doesn't get fully fleshed out again until the 1980s, when we have the Black feminist movement with people like Barbara Smith and the others who call themselves the Combahee River Collective, who would talk about what Black feminism meant. And therefore that Black feminism for them meant a series of ways in which Black women in the United States and in the third world, they would actually use that language, would have to find ways to struggle to attain rights in terms of academically, you know, getting access to institutions and so on, but also looking at the knowledge framework as really critically part of that as well. So I'm saying that even though you have Black feminist movement, that for me represents the ideological side, just like how you have Marxism representing sort of class-related issues. Feminism then becomes a sort of ideological movement, but the question of rights can be taken in many different directions if one were to follow that debate in terms of really accessing the claims that were made in some of these movements.
What would you say really surprised you the most?
Well, what surprised me is not so much as a surprise, but the question of the sort of incremental movement. So at the turn of the century, in other words, 2000, the year 2000, there was 6% of women in political leadership. Think about it, 6%. And there's a landmark essay that I reference in the book by Decima Williams, where it titled something like bringing more women into leadership. So moving from that 6% now into the year 2022, it's more like 23%. So basically we've had a steady movement, but people who study this question from international agencies and so on still feel that's not enough, that it's a kind of slow trek, you know, and that if we keep moving at this pace, it will take until something like 21 something before we have parity. I don't know. I think I'm more optimistic. I'm more optimistic because I'm seeing the movements and I'm seeing, this is what this book is claiming, that this century is going to be the century in which you see more Black women moving into political leadership, and I'm seeing the evidence of it. And I think you will see some missteps, you will see some problems, but generally the movement is going to keep going forward. And that's my argument. But a really nice aspect of this work, which you would be happy about, is of course the fact of having Wangechi Mutu's detail from the seated four on the cover. In terms of biography of the book, that is really one of the most amazing contributions. And I was actually studying Wangechi's work one day, just looking online and looking at some things that she had done. And when I saw the seated four that the four pieces actually, the piece I have is from the seated four. She was actually talking about the history of Black women's leadership and wanting to capture that powerfully in those four that ended up being in the portico of the Met in New York. And one night I was chatting with a friend who is an artist from Jamaica, Peter Wayne Lewis. And I said, it would be amazing, he knew about this book, it was done. And I said, it would be amazing if I could get something like Wangechi for the cover. And he said, wow, I know Wangechi. And he stood up and called her right away. And she picked up the phone in Kenya, and it was like 2 a.m. or something. And he put me on the phone and I explained what it was. And she said, well, send me a text, send me an email. And I did both. And she responded in the next week, and it was done. And of course, we did the contract. And she required a fee, of course, and we did that. And the rest is history. So I'm really proud to. In other words, anybody who gets the book is getting a piece of Wangechi as well, and I'm really happy.
What would you say are the new trends in this conversation about Black women's rights? What are the new trends?
Well, first of all, there's been a long history of Black women as political leaders, pre-colonial leaders for sure. And there's the historians, the African historians who do work on women like Nwando Achebe and others, they've done really nice work in fleshing out some of that detail. So one person like me depends on that kind of historical scholarship to know what has happened. And taking it all the way back to the Candaces in the Pharaonic period, Nubia and so on, you have women in leadership. The feminists had argued well that once you have that transition from a certain kind of traditional matriarchal foundation to colonial patriarchal modes, you end up having sort of a male dominant paradigm coming into play in the colonial period. And essentially, of course, there's a lot of different arguments about it. Some people talk about women having dual streams of power, in different areas. And it's really nice scholarship on this question, which took place quite substantially throughout my graduate school days, particularly in places like Ibadan and looking at the work that came from Senegal and so on. However, what does not come out strongly enough is that even the major leaders who came to power in that period, we're talking about people like Kwame Nkrumah, Secretary, and so on, they came to power often with a lot of mobilization from women that they were able to get active in terms of pushing forward the questions of independence. Women were always fighting for independence, but often what happened, sadly, across the world is that once independence happened, women were sort of pushed back into not really having a major say in how those countries were run. So I remember the famous statement by Nkrumah, which is quite forward thinking for the time, where he says that you can measure a nation's ability to define itself by the standard of its women. But he still did not have women in power. In fact, he said he wanted women to go and really help motivate the men to really take forward the gains of independence. So I think it's not so much that he was hostile to women or against, but there was a general tendency at that time among leaders, and this is worldwide, not just African leaders, to assume that leadership had to be male. So the assumption of leadership being male runs across the board everywhere. So finding ways then to get women to access leadership or to claim leadership is an ongoing struggle. And you see it bit by bit everywhere. Stacey Adams in the US, Shirley Chisholm earlier. Across the world, we see versions of this taking place. And in each case, whenever women get to leadership, you can see some substantial movements, particularly if, and of course you see some horrible mistakes too. That's with the last British PM. But you see some substantial movements, and particularly in Africa and the third world, once those women get to power. What you asked in terms of trends is fascinating to me, because Colombia, for example, the country of Colombia recently elected for the first time a Black woman vice president. And up until then, or up until World Cup. Usually you don't see black faces in Colombia. You only see black people when it's World Cup and the guys are playing football, right? And then it's like, oh, there are black people there. But there's quite a large population of black people all across South America, all across the Americas, let's say. And they often are made invisible, and more the scholarship is making them visible. So Francia Marquez in Colombia ran initially on her own to be the president and got really a lot of votes from the party. And this is why she ended up being on the ticket to be vice president. And they won, and we were so amazed when that happened. I was in Cuba at the time. Now, in terms of trends as well, Cuba, because of the US blockades and embargoes, it's really difficult for the information about Cuba to get forward to our knowledge. But Cuba has parity. They have 52.3, I believe, or 52.1% women in leadership in Cuba. And I was told there, I was on sabbatical there last year. When I did research there, they indicated that the way that they do it is that women develop expertise at the local level. And then once they, begin to be credible leaders at that level, then they move to a different level in terms of accessing power and so on. The difference in the United States is that if you want to run for office, you have to first of all learn how to raise money. So the capitalist imperative really dominates as opposed to knowledge or skill or practice and so on. Whereas in a place like Cuba, you have people really learning how to be a leader and how to really develop the qualities that would go with that leadership. So those are some of the trends. This is why my point is that you will see in this century more advanced leadership coming from women, probably not so much in the United States, but in other places around the world and the Caribbean and Latin America for sure.
How are women now navigating this oppressive mechanism that for centuries have really continued not just to deny women their own rights, but also to make sure that the conversation about women's rights are either muted or absent?
Yeah, consistent, I would say consistency and just staying with it. And that's probably the hardest part. And finding ways to convince community, not so much the leaders, that one has the ability to lead and one has the skill to do so. And so what I've found is that you have a number of organizations which are in place to actually provide examples or help women who want to run for office around the world. And sometimes they fund workshops or campaigns or what have you in order to help. So in other words, there has to be, for women to move, it seems, if you want to look at it globally, a combination of those things, the kind of community support, leadership at the local level for sure, which we cannot discount because making it all the way to being a prime minister or what have you is kind of a long shot. But women have a lot of impact on their local communities as well. And the local leadership is really significantly important here as well. And then, of course, finding ways to advance a position that would just benefit, I would say, communities more than the individual. That has been the paradigm, it seems, consistently.
Well, one of the things that I'm quite fascinated by listening to you and looking at what your book has covered is this global view. But I wanted to know from you, what do you think is the importance of that global view about this concept? Can you tell me more a little bit about that?
Well, yeah, I think, first of all, it's very ambitious to be able to want to do that for sure, and to actually have the ability to do it. And I think I do. So therefore, it's something that it's part of my own intellectual formation. So I have the ability to do that, and therefore I can. And even so, you always feel at the end of it that, did you cover everything? And of course you cannot, right? So you do the best that you can. But according to Vivek Clark, who developed a term called diaspora literacy, one needs to at least be knowledgeable of at least 4 points of the African diaspora. And I probably more than 4 at the time that she wrote it, she said 4. She was thinking about Africa, the Caribbean, North America, and of course, the United States and North America, sorry, which is the United States, and of course, Europe. But one could extend it even further and think of it Australia, and you could think of the Middle East and the so-called Middle East, or Asia and so on. So probably we have to, it's a good concept, but it needs to be more expansive to pick up the entire logic of the world where Black people reside. So first of all, very ambitious. But in my particular case, I focused on African women. I focused on the United States. I focused on Caribbean and Brazil and Latin America as well. And the early part of the work looked at some of the historical developments in terms of women in political leadership in various movements in the United States and other parts of the world. And just some of the theoretical questions that have plagued women consistently all the years that they've been sort of moving towards leadership. Basically, from my experience, all of the women I've talked to, they really all say they want a more equitable world. And to me, that is the benefit. They want a more equitable world for everybody, not an assumption of trying to take over from men or to dominate men as people with stereotype feminist movements and so on. But in women's rights discourses, they would want an equitable world where distribution of resources is much more practical, where women are able to access the basic human rights that everybody should have. And those rights, of course, are really significantly important, right to have an education, the right to have good housing, the right to be able to select your leaders, the right to be free from violence. So I used as fundamental the convention called CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, as the marker, because that's what sets out in place the protocols for what should be women's rights everywhere. And then the African Women's Protocol, which was similarly based on that. Usually they're based on the founding, protocol. That African Women's Protocol, which is available online, one can find it on the African Union website and several other locations, which was ratified eventually in 2006. That one is really worth looking at as well, because some of the things, as I mentioned earlier, and I talk about this in the book, that people like Amata and others wrote about, asking for those rights, are now in those protocols. So I found a really interesting relationship then between the writing and what women were claiming. Even somebody like Buchia Macheta, who was saying she's a feminist, but not with a big F, with a small f. And to me, that small f feminism is pretty much where everybody is now. So she, in spite of the fact that at the time when she said it, it sounded like, everybody was excited with feminism and so on. How could she say a small f? But basically that's what it is. So in other words, feminism is not the only identity, but it's one that is leavened by its relationship with the geographical, political, or other kinds of identities that define it as well.
Is there anything else you would like to share with me about your book that I've not asked you?
Oh, wow. What can I say? My daughter, Dahlia, when I showed her she loves Wangechi Muthu's work. When I showed her the Wangechi piece that I was interested in, she immediately created a design, and this is what became the book cover. So she got credit in the back. And interesting, I have one daughter who's a graphic artist, and she normally is the one who does sketches for me for stuff like this. But this was the other daughter who is a more journalist, but she was so excited about Wangechi. So she ended up getting the credit along with Wangechi. When you look at the book, you'll see her name is listed there, Dahlia Davies Flanagan. So I thank her for that. But she was the kind of daughter who, when I was a young prof, and she was like maybe 7 or 8, and I'd be trying to go to a conference, I'd be printing my paper, rushing. She'd be like, I got it, I'm printing it for you. And by the time I'm ready to go, she would have it ready for me, stapled and everything. She's that kind of kid. So she has been an amazing assistant from the start in a very indirect way. But the two of them have been phenomenal in terms of that. And I really am thankful for their input. Because it's not easy having a mom who was, an academic rushing off to meetings and class and conferences, and that they survived that is really wonderful.